Russia's presidential election takes place about 6 weeks from now. The Kremlin has been clamping down on critical voices, and as the opposition politician at the heart of this story, Alexei Navalny will tell you there's nothing particularly subtle about the government's tactics. Navalny was arrested last weekend. His YouTube-based channel was shut down in the middle of a broadcast. He was probably banking on the attention that he gets from global news outlets. International coverage, along with his online following, have been central to Navalny's media strategy, as the Kremlin has steadily tightened the screws on domestic news outlets. Over the past few years, ownership of mass media in Russia has shifted almost entirely into the hands of the Kremlin's allies. Moscow has also blocked access to VPNs, the virtual private networks that allowed citizens to circumvent censorship online. And a new law is in the works that would require some journalists and bloggers to register as foreign agents. It's no wonder that the loudest voices in Russia these days are those who call President Vladimir Putin a national savior. Our starting point this week is Moscow. Not to sell Alexei Navalny short, but his arrest last weekend in Moscow does not really fall under the category of breaking news in Russia. It's the fourth time Navalny's been arrested since calling for a boycott of a presidential election in which he has been banned from running. Both his arrest and the storming of his foundation's YouTube studio in mid-broadcast were tailor-made moments for the media.
Доброе утро! Еще раз вы смотрите новости на канале Navalny Live. И главная новость происходит прямо сейчас.
That sound you hear is a chainsaw, the police playing their part in the news spectacle.
This particular video is pretty dramatic. During the conversation that the hosts are having while the police is trying to break through the door,
Хорошо, удостоверение ваше покажете?
They're calling themselves journalists. But if you're working for a politician and this is a political channel, probably you're not really a journalist. This whole video falls into Alexei Navalny's campaign strategy. He knows if he goes out, he will probably be arrested, and the footage that you saw was done quite professionally. You see two young girls looking at him with admiration as if he were some celebrity.
This is an opportunity to mobilize supporters and perhaps acquire new ones. Because if he doesn't produce media events, he will disappear as a politician. It's also an opportunity to show one more time to the global community that the leader of a protest has been arrested and isolated. And when the Western media covers the arrest, it helps him build his image overseas.
Somebody has to cover Alexei Navalny, since Russian news outlets owned or controlled by the Kremlin have effectively blackballed him. Western news organizations, however, have never met a Russian dissident they didn't like.
Is it worth your life? Because there is a big target on you, no question.
Whether it's a Soviet-era Sakharov or Solzhenitsyn, or a Navalny today.
Your position.
They tend to give the Navalny story the surface treatment. The one-time blogger, the anti-corruption crusader, who bypassed pro-Putin news media by using social media to take on the Kremlin. Where the foreign coverage tends to fall short, though, is the Navalny backstory, his past flirtations with Russian nationalist movements. In 2007, he likened Muslims to insects. In 2008, it was Georgians. He called them rodents and said they should all be deported from Russia. And in 2013, he publicly backed nationalist skinheads who attacked immigrants.
That used to be one of the main points of criticism of Alexei Navalny is his nationalistic ideas, but recently he tried to shift more to mainstream liberal values. So I don't think that Western media didn't notice some nationalistic ideas. They just don't write about this now because he doesn't say anything nationalistic anymore.
Navalny's base of support is not in Moscow, it is not in Russia, but it is mostly in the West, among American government officials, among American media, and some European governments that believe that his political activities in Russia benefit them. And that is why in the Western media. Navalny is presented as a martyr, but the reality is that the government in Russia is quite lenient when it comes to Navalny and his supporters.
Because even though Vladimir Putin has authoritarian tendencies, his government applies them quite selectively. Politically, that means a dissident like Alexei Navalny gets arrested frequently, but is never locked up for long. The Kremlin takes a similar approach to the news media. Again, it can act in authoritarian ways, but falls somewhere short of being dictatorial.
The first thing Vladimir Putin did when he came to power in 2000 was arresting the owner of NTV channel. He obtained control over TV pretty quickly. Then he took control over the biggest internet newspapers like Gazeta.ru, Lenta.ru, but then social networks became very important. And he faced the problem that he cannot just close Facebook. So this is the biggest challenge now for the Kremlin.
There is a cluster of media outlets that the state directly influences in terms of editorial policy. Channel 1 and VIKTOR, for example, both of which are state-owned channels. Then there are media outlets owned by large businesses that are loyal to the state. This includes Channel 5, Izvestia, and REN TV. There is no doubt that there are lists of people like Navalny who are banned from appearing on these channels. And then there are oppositional media, such as Novaya Gazeta, Media Zona, and Meduza, which take the counter position more. And media executives have developed an internal system of values where they self-censor over what kinds of things they can and cannot say. Otherwise, they wouldn't keep their jobs.
But still, if you are not a very big informational source, if you have less than 1 million viewers per month, usually they will allow you to exist.
There's a reason for that. Vladimir Putin understands that he does not need to control all of the Russian news media, just the bulk of it, the major players. Which is why, for the most part, the Kremlin leaves newspapers alone, knowing that print journalism is nowhere near as influential as television. And by tolerating the existence of an independently minded radio station like Echo Moscow, or a relatively small critical television outlet, Dozhd, there is just enough media plurality in Russia for the government's defenders to say things like this.
Contrary to popular Western opinion, not all media in Russia support government positions. There are opposition magazines and newspapers. There are opposition radio stations. Navalny has access to newspapers and magazines. He has access to radio. He has access to Dozhd channel, for example. And despite all that, we see in the last few months, in the last year, that he has not been able to garner significant support.
With Alexei Navalny effectively neutralized, that clears the way for Russian mainstream media outlets to focus on the job at hand, which is casting Vladimir Putin, the president who stood up to the West during the showdown over Ukraine, as the savior that Russia and Russians need.
They are only focused on how bad is everything in Ukraine.
Уж сколько на Украине было митингов против коррупции.
How bad the situation is in the European Union because of immigration, because it's explained like invasion of Muslims in Europe. They try to explain that Russia is the only one island in the ocean of crisis of economy and values. And Vladimir Putin is the one who is defending us from this invasion.
There is a specific narrative that they are trying to push right now. There is this documentary about Putin restoring an ancient monastery in Valam in the northern part of Russia.
Герой. Образец для подражания. Верующий президент, атакующий сильно.
And the message of this story is to try to combine some sort of religious narrative and Putin's ability to restore justice, to bring order, and to show him as this national savior. So that sort of religious sentiment that plays here is something that the Kremlin is trying to exploit.
That added religious element suggests that after all these years, Russian news outlets are still managing to find new ways to showcase Vladimir Putin. As far as most of the mainstream media are concerned, this story is about a national savior, he who must not be questioned, against a flawed outsider, he who must not be mentioned. It's no contest, and that's just how the Kremlin likes it.